Hello and welcome to the Overland Journal podcast. I am your host, Scott Brady, and I am here with my co-host with his very coiffed due. And I'm also...
I don't know what that word means.
You're well coiffed. I am not well coiffed. Matt Scott.
Hi, I'm here. Today we're talking about what size tire and lift. Actually, we're not talking about that. Do not message us asking what size tire and lift we have. We will send you inappropriate pictures of my dog. Not inappropriate, just very
pictures.
Appropriate.
Lots of pictures of your
just
dog.
Just pictures of my dog. Yeah.
This episode is supported by Lifesaver Jerry Cans. Long before they became a sponsor, these cans were my water tank of choice. And that is because of the flexibility of these units and the technology that they have integrated into the product. They're 18.5 liters, so just about 4.5 gallons. These cans are made from really thick and durable BPA and BPS free plastic. And that meets NSF P248 and Medcom standards. And you can see it in the product. You can see how well it is constructed. For overlanding, it reduces the turbidity of glacial water, or if you have to pull water out of a muddy creek, for example. And it also includes a complete filter unit with an integrated pump. And that pump can be used for not only dispensing water, but also for pressurizing the tank to use as a shower as well. And that's an optional accessory. And it will purify up to 20,000 liters of water. And it does improve the flavor as well. I noticed that. So even if I'm getting water out of a spigot in some location that I don't know, I notice that the water tastes much better because of the carbon filters as well. You can find out more information on iconlifesaver.com.
Anyway, so I think one of the most contentious arguments I think people get into in the overland space, in the four-wheel drive space, is tire size, tire width, tire preference, all-terrain, mud terrain. We have these kind of new hybrid, I call them hybrid all-terrain tires.
That's right.
You know, what size wheels? There's a lot of different
type of wheels.
What type of wheels? Yeah, there's a lot going on, I guess, with this subject. You know, admittedly, Scott is better at the absolute technical details. I mean, if you want somebody that's like a scientist of like the mechanics of all this stuff, Scott's definitely gonna be the best person for that. So I guess I'm just here for the ride and to interject opinions.
No, but you've also had so many sets of tires because you've had so many vehicles that naturally means that you're going to. Yeah. So today's topic is going to be the principles of overlanding tires and wheel.
Basically, we're just going to tell you to go with one size tire less than you think you want.
Yeah.
And well, that's the podcast for today. Have fun.
Maybe we get started with some of the more broad, kind of sweeping topics. And I think that one of the things that's most important that we always reiterate in these podcasts is you don't really need to do anything. Even a stock Tacoma with a swag in the back and a couple bags and stock tires and wheels and everything else like that's going to take you around the world. Always default to, can I spend this money on fuel to go someplace interesting, as opposed to at the end of this conversation, you feel like you've got to change your tires because you're much better off just wearing those out, doing a bunch of fun stuff, and then maybe reconsider for later. One of the things that we do talk about a lot and has been a subject bantered about in the forums for decades is tall and narrow versus tall and wide. And there really is two ways to think about it. On that whole science topic is we have to understand the coefficient of friction. It removes this whole idea that wider is better or narrower is better. The coefficient of friction basically means as the tire gets wider, it has more adhesion. As the tire gets narrower, it has more vertical load pressure. So they basically cancel each other out. On a glass surface, like a perfectly smooth surface, tall is the same as wide because...
Fascinating.
Yeah.
That's
so
an interesting way of putting that.
It actually doesn't matter. Now, there are... Once you get off of that perfectly smooth surface, then you absolutely have influences that start to change. Should I go with a wide tire or should I go with a narrow tire?
Yeah. I mean, and I guess to add to that, I feel like this kind of goes to the steel versus aluminum wheels. Like right. I remember, like 10, 15 years ago, where if you had aluminum wheels, you were a poser. Like if you had leather in your Land Rover, it was a really, really bad thing.
Yeah.
And I think that's kind of the same thing. I mean, one thing that and this is just interjecting opinion, but I feel like everything's just gone relatively wide. Vehicles have, better brakes, better suspension, better dampening, more appropriate gearing. I feel like people are actually finally starting to gear their vehicles for that additional rotating mass and loss of leverage. I don't know. I mean, what's your thing? You've kind of always been a tall and skinny guy.
Yes. Not myself personally have been a tall and wide guy, but
yeah, you're the wide guy that's into the skinny, and I'm the skinny that's into the, I don't really have a preference. I'm an equal opportunity tire employer.
Yeah. So I have always chosen to go with more of a narrow tire, and I'll explain why that's been my approach. There are some just thoughtful considerations around that. Most of the time you're better off going with about the same width of tire that would be the widest tire available from the factory, and then simply add aspect ratio. So if it's a 265/70, then go to a 265/75. So, and the reason for that is the wheel well is designed for a specific width of tire. So if you go much wider, it either gets outside of the wheel well or it won't tuck fully up into the wheel well. So then you end up with additional rubbing that also affects the sweep of the tire. So a wider tire will have a wider sweep, which again results in more rubbing on the vehicle. So if you start off with a little bit narrower tire that's just taller, it will fit up in the same compression on the wheel well. The other thing to consider too is a narrower tire has less rotating and reciprocating mass. So it's easier to accelerate, it's easier to stop, and it's easier to control with the suspension because there's less weight. The other thing that a lot of times people don't think about is you gain fuel economy by not going wider. That's frontal resistance as far as airflow, and it's rolling resistance on the tire as well. So that's another thing that you have to really consider. One of the main reasons why you see locals in Africa will use narrower tires is that it keeps everybody in the same track. So you have less tire on the road, which means you have less surface area that's going to pick up a thorn or a glass bottle or a piece of sharp metal. There's actually less tire.
Yeah, that's good.
So statistically, the narrower you go, the lower the likelihood is that you're going to end up with a flat. So those are all things to consider. There are absolutely reasons to go with wider tires. You start to run into the mechanical limits of adhesion with a narrow tire. It's the reason why sports cars don't come with narrow tires anymore, is because there's so much power that as that rotating torque starts to limit the adhesion, you actually tear the tire away. So you burn rubber. That's actually what happens, as opposed to the rubber continuing to stick and the vehicle launching. So there are advantages around mechanical keying and adhesion. We'll talk about those in a few minutes. So those are definitely things to consider when you look at a wide versus narrow tire.
Yeah. And I think another thing, for travelers is actually figure out if you can get those tires. For example, on my Land Cruiser, I have what I think is a relatively ideal size tire. It's a Falcon AT3W. I like it because it's a winter rated tire. I don't necessarily want to be limited as to where I can go, especially with some states that require a winter snowflake rating. But I'm not going to find a 34 inch by 11 by 17. I mean, I can't even get that in Prescott.
Right.
Like I have to special order that. So maybe this doesn't actually just apply to, to global guys, but I couldn't get that tire size in Moab.
Yeah.
Granted, I do carry a spare, but then obviously then you don't have a spare if you use that one. So I think it's important to consider where you're going, how you're using the vehicle. There's something to be said for common size tires.
Correct.
It's way easier these days to find a 17-inch tire than it is a 16 or even a 15, because think about it. I mean, whatever size tire a lifted Jeep runs, you're always going to be able to find that. You'll always be able to find a 33, 1050, 17.
Yep.
I'm just going to drop the wheel size, but you'll always be able to find a 33. You'll always be able to find a 35.
Yeah.
And these days, you'll pretty much always be able to find a 37. They're just so common.
Yeah.
Between the JKs, JLs, Gladiators, Raptors, a lot of things. So I guess that's my little tidbit of advice. Maybe less technical.
That's super valid. And it's the reason why when you go to Africa, you typically see a 7.5 R16 on a Nissan Patrol and on a G-Wagon and on a Defender and on a 70 series, is that everybody runs those tires, and you can find them in Maun in the middle of Botswana. They actually have those tires there. But it's also not a reason to buy that size. Modern tires are so much better. I've had so few flats.
You've had one flat.
Yeah.
And I've had one flat driving my mom's Lexus when she came to visit in Colorado.
Yeah, you just don't get flats as often anymore. And if you pay attention to the road as you're driving, the reason why I got a flat is I was screwing with the GPS. And as a result, I hit a rock and opened up a sidewall on a tire. But it's fairly rare to get catastrophic flats anymore. Most of them you can patch and repair, can plug. You can just get you back to the road. So it really isn't that you've got to go with this ubiquitous size. We don't want to do something really weird. Like an 18 internationally is going to be hard to find.
Any tire that comes on a modern Land Rover is going to be.
Or a modern Land Cruiser. Yeah. Yeah. It's going to be available. Oh, you mean, yeah, right. Anything that's, yeah.
No, I'm saying that the weird, I mean, you can't even, like Land Rovers seem to come with a lot of 19-inch wheel sizes is kind of the smallest that you can go.
Right.
And I think there's one Goodyear Duratrack that isn't even sold in the United States and you have to get it from the UK.
Yeah, you're right.
Don't use that tire.
Yeah.
That is going to end up in a bad time.
Yeah. And that is such a challenge. You wonder, I mean, I think they try to solve all these engineering problems and they don't think about the end use case. If it's bigger than an 18, it's typically not going to work well.
Hot take. They really think about the end use case because the people buying those cars want 20s.
Yeah.
They want big cars.
Yeah.
Or big tires.
Big wheels. Yeah.
That's controversial. And let's move on.
Yeah, exactly. So, and then another thought that we always have is bigger tires always better? In most cases, they actually are. And that is somewhat contrarian to the way that I viewed tires even 15 years ago. But once I started going to Iceland and I started experiencing the benefit of truly massive tires.
Yeah, but think 15 years ago when we were building Discovery Ones and that kind of stuff, you couldn't put a 37. Like I felt dirty putting a 37 on my Gladiator, which is my main travel vehicle, but anything smaller would have kind of been awkward. Like it only has a 2-inch lift.
Yeah.
And it fits a 37-inch tire because, in a relatively short amount of time, the axle strength, broad strokes here, the axle strength doubled, the horsepower doubled, the amount of available gears in the transmission doubled.
Yeah.
The performance of traction control doubled. Yeah. There's a lot of things that have happened.
That really do facilitate a much larger tire.
Yeah. Even 5 years ago, I would have said, oh, this is my usual thing, needs versus wants, right? You don't need 37-inch tires for almost anything in the overland space unless you're
really need flotation or tons of ground clearance.
Yeah. Boy, they are nice.
Yeah.
Because there's really no downside to it. I'll get 50, 60,000 miles out of those tires where, again, I feel like the length of how many miles you can get from the tires has doubled.
Yeah. And a larger diameter tire will give you much better wear because it's a larger diameter. So it's spinning less, rotations to cover the same distance. And that's certainly a consideration. And there's a lot of ride quality benefits to a larger tire too. When you air them down, they're much more comfortable, a lot more deformation of the carcass. There's a lot more leverage off road. So it's that much easier to get up and over ledges. Every corrugation is smaller. So there are really big benefits to big tires. And if you look at like an AEV Dodge Ram, for example, I know we use that as an example often, which that's just incidental, but they fit those things with 40-inch tall tires and they actually work really well with that tire on there.
Yeah. I mean, think again, you talk a lot about flotation, a 7,000-pound 4Runner on a 32-inch tire versus a, 8,500-pound truck on 40-inch tires.
Yep.
Think of the footprint. It's, the ground doesn't really know much difference if maybe the Ram is actually lighter.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah. It's pretty amazing to drive off highway with a tire like a 40 or a 44-inch tall tire. I think about the Arctic trucks that I've used in mixed terrain. In Iceland, you can encounter everything from rock to really peaty areas to deep mud and glaciers and everything else. And it is shocking how well those vehicles work. It's run effortless.
4 to 8 PSI
at the most. I mean, when you're on the trail, you run about 8 PSI. And then when you're climbing a glacier, when you need maximum traction, you can be down to 2 or 3 PSI.
That's crazy.
Yeah, it's incredible how well they work.
And we're talking a lot about traction and larger tires and stuff. Just as a brief overview, as you air those tires down, which you should always do when you're off-road, it has a myriad of benefits, but you're actually mainly increasing the footprint in terms of length.
That's correct.
Not as much as you would think in terms of width.
Yep.
There's a great Instagram account, Dirt Sunrise. Kelsey and Tim. Kelsey used to work here. They actually, These guys are really, really knowledgeable. They've traveled all over. And they actually took the time on I want to say they did a video or an Instagram post about like putting ink on the tire and then jacking the vehicle up, putting ink on the tire and saying, here's what this tire looks like at 60 PSI, all the way down to almost nothing. And it's crazy how I want to say they had 35-inch tires on their Land Cruiser. Turns into a little mini tank track.
They really do. And you get 80% of the improvement in flotation from the increased length of the tread. Only about 20% of it comes. Now that varies upon construction. So an E-rated tire will deform slightly different. But for this example, you get about 80% of the increased flotation from the length of the tread, which is actually really a huge benefit because then you're not, again, introducing all of this frontal resistance from a wider tire. So going tall and narrow, that's the advantage. You create those mini tank tracks.
Yeah, which is great.
Yeah, totally.
I like it.
Yeah, absolutely. So when it comes to tall and narrow, default that direction unless the conditions demand it, which would be something like I'm climbing a glacier. So there's ways to do that. And then bigger we always have to remember, off-road bigger is almost always better. There are, of course, limitations to that. And we could spend 3 hours talking about that. But if you have a Gladiator and you can fit 37s on it easily, like Matt has just described, that's going to provide a bunch of benefits in that regard. There are certainly downsides. There's the falsifiability of all of these suggestions, but we do need to, reinforce that that's an advantage when it comes to that. And then I guess we could probably talk more kind of just more of the general stuff too. Like siping is a great example of a technology.
I've never siped my tires, but it is something that you can do that drastically improves the traction of that tire.
True. Although you mentioned that you use a snowflake tire,
which has additional siping.
They will typically have siping from the factory. That's one of the reasons why I also really like a snowflake or snow rated tire because they will have much more siping. And these are these very fine cuts in the tire. You can add them after the fact. Some people will sipe a mud tire, for example, or they will come factory siped. And what happens is those very thin cuts, when you start to put rotational force in it, either you're accelerating or braking, it slightly opens up that gap and it introduces this very sharp edge to the surface, which makes a huge improvement in wet weather, icy conditions. And it also makes a huge difference. It makes a huge difference on rocks and everything else. The only time you start to notice some downside is you'll get some stone retention, some pebble retention in those sipes. And then it also can result in the lug integrity problems of chunking and tearing. So that's just something to be aware of is if you have a heavy right foot, siping will typically result in a lot of damage to the tire. So
yeah, but heavy right foot's generally fun.
It can be for sure. Yeah, totally.
Yeah.
Yeah. So siping is a consideration. I also think that people spend too much time focusing on tread life.
Yeah.
In my opinion.
Well, because it's so subjective.
It is.
Depending on what you're driving, for example, like I do a lot of gravel, Baja, Arizona, West Coast, a lot of Forest Service roads. I would say of the off-highway miles I do, 90% of them are on gravel. And gravel really chews tires up.
It does.
So finding a tire that works for the conditions that you're actually in. Yep. I talked to my buddy Adam, Overland History, on Instagram, and he just moved out from the East Coast, and the tires he has on his truck now are really appropriate for the East Coast. But out here, I mean, like in my personal experience, every time I've put mud terrain tires on a vehicle for how I travel, they chunk, they have issues. And most of that is all just gravel related.
Yeah, that totally makes sense. And if you look at like a typical tire use in Australia and Africa, you'll see them most often with either a hybrid or an all-terrain because they do hold up a lot better. There's a lot more lug integrity because of the connection between the lugs. But when it comes to tread life, people will say, oh, I'm going to buy this tire because it has a 60,000 mile tread warranty. So that's a positive. In that it has a long tread life and a long warranty. Here's the downside that really makes a difference. When you get a tire that lasts that long, it has to be made to last that long, which means that it is going to have a very hard durometer, which is going to directly affect adhesion and micro keying off-road. So there's a reason why most of the best off-road tires have a very soft rubber compound is because they work better on hard rock, on granite, on slick rock, because you have much better adhesion. There's a reason why race cars have very soft tires.
Yeah, you don't want Fisher-Price Hot Wheels. Well, there's the example is the Power Wheel that I had when I was quite young, very young, like, I don't know, 2 or 3.
How often did you buy and sell Hot Wheels? I'm just trying to get a frame of reference. Did you trade Hot Wheel cars and did you buy?
No, I bought and sold Pokemon cards like at like age 8 or something. I had the distinct advantage of my grandpa's company at the time put the wrapping over the Pokemon cards.
Oh, so wow. This is a huge advantage.
I was wiping my behind with Charizards. That will make no sense to anybody over 35. I'm sorry. But anyway, no, but like the whole concept of like that Power Wheel thing, you hear the kids out driving around and it's like they're loud, they're hard, they don't get grip.
Yeah.
You don't want that.
You really don't, unless your only goal is to make the tires last as physically as long as possible.
Which I think there is a use case for
sure.
Buddy of mine, David Prittis, who's driven all over the world in a Defender, uses Michelin tires because they wear so long, because he knows he doesn't necessarily have a problem. Oh, if I get stuck, I'll winch out. I have Max Trax or whatever. And, they just last a really long time. And for a traveler that's on a budget and is considering those things, maybe that is a valid point, but you may not get the same level of performance.
Yeah. What a great example, Matt. And it's so important to talk about things like that because tires are expensive. So if long tread life or accessibility to tires in Africa or some location that may be difficult, you may want something that lasts a lot longer. But usually, the difference is maybe 10 to 15,000 miles. So it's not a big difference, but that is totally valid. Yeah.
Yeah. I don't know.
Yeah. So I think tread life is something don't use that as the reason to buy the tires or as some great advantage for an off-road tire. They also can tear more often because they're harder compound. They can chunk and tear more readily because, again, they're a much harder compound. So that's something to consider as well. Another thing that you see a lot on these tires is these bead protectors, and they kind of
protrude out from the rim.
Yeah. I've never actually seen them protect anything other than they get torn and kind of shredded, and then you see them hanging.
Like they get those fine cuts because they don't actually have any. There's no fibers or anything to actually hold that rubber in. I don't mind the concept, nor do I mind the concept of having like kind of that shoulder armor on the tire.
That I like.
In fact, if you go back, I'll use the BF Goodrich KO2. I think that's a KO, I should say.
Yeah.
The BF Goodrich All-Terrain, you had the KO, which had kind of 2 different iterations. And you had the KO2, and you go back and you're like, wow, that sidewall looks really naked.
Yeah.
That's definitely, in my opinion, that was an area where I would always see failures on the trail was like guys that at the time, maybe 10 years ago, had older style tires that didn't have that.
Sure.
That shoulder armor. I don't think it's necessarily the end all be all.
No, I think you're right. Absolutely. That's been my experience too, is that when the shoulder lugs wrap around to the side of the carcass, it does provide some flat protection. It actually provides some additional traction if you're in a rut or you're climbing up using just the part of the sidewall of the tire. There's definitely some advantages, particularly when you're airing down. So I think you're right. I think that some of them can look ridiculous. I think there was one that looked like some bullets or something.
There's the bullet one, and then there's the flame one,
which they look so ridiculous.
And they're all sold by, I'm going to stop myself there. Anyway, but don't get a gimmicky tire is what I'm trying to say.
But I do think you're right. I think that those shoulder lugs have merit. They do add weight and they add some additional chunking possibilities. But I think the upside far outweighs the downside.
Yeah. It's a little bit more weight, but vehicles these days,
they're heavy.
They're heavy. They can handle.
It's probably marginal on the weight. It's definitely something to consider, but the bead protector thing, don't use it as a reason to buy the tire. I've just seen those things just get torn and they kind of hang like little flaps off the side of the tire. Yeah. So they don't seem to perform a great function in that regard. All right. Well, now let's talk about the different types of tires. So you tend to favor the all-terrains, Matt, and kind of talk about why you use an all-terrain. What do you look for in an all-terrain?
Number one thing I look for is a winter rating. Being a millennial, I have to have a snowflake rating, I'm told. So that snowflake rating, super important.
Matt,
I can't drive without it.
Matt is snowflake rated.
I'm snowflake rated. No, but that is a really big thing. I mean, I want to say Washington, Oregon, passes in Colorado, a lot of places. It's snowflake rated tires, which is a snow tire or winter tire. That is kind of the accepted standard that is used. So that's really important.
I agree. And I find that it's a big upside for other performance attributes too. They tend to have more siping. They tend to be a softer durometer. And they tend to have a little bit more carbon black in there, which improves ice and wet condition performance. So, good stuff. So for me, that kind of has it in my history of overlanding has brought me to two tires, has brought me to kind of the BFG all-terrain. And I had run that forever, but I always had problems with chipping, and chunking and gravel. Big time. I chased the Rebel Rally as media in, I want to say it was the first one. So it would have been like 2016. I had a brand new set of 35-inch BF Goodrich KO2s. Great tire. I think they perform really well. But I completely roasted them after one trip. And I'm like, that wasn't good. And then I switched to these Falcons. And that was when I learned differences in rubber can make a huge difference for how you're actually using the tire. Yeah. I think probably the BF Goodrich is a higher performing tire, probably has better limit handling. That's why I kept them on my Raptor, but they've got to work on gravel for me. Yeah. Most of my cars generally all fit lockers or they come with lockers. So I can overcome most of the things I find on an overland style trip just through that. That first generation of Falcon ATs was like magic on hard rock. They actually used a racing car compound to make those ATs. I never had any chunking or tearing and they were insane on hard rock.
And I guess I bring up Falcon a lot, but it's because I was like so impressed. I thought they were kind of a discount, cheap tire brand. And I don't want to say I haven't associated with those brands, but I was never naturally drawn to them. BF Goodrich has like the storied history in Baja. But then you really start to look at it and they're Sumitomo rubber. They're Dunlop. They're one of the world's largest tire companies. They just don't own Dunlop in the United States. They make every tire that leaves a Toyota factory in Japan. Yeah. Those tires are on them.
They're really good quality.
Yeah. So, but anyways, I guess I'm on a little bit of a tangent, snowflake rating, they've got to work in gravel for me, which I guess is just something you kind of have to, test and try and, ask, trusted friends yourself. Those are my two biggest things. And I don't encounter a lot of mud. When I look at the places that I go, it's the West Coast of the United States. It's rock, it's shale, it's sand. An all-terrain tire, while it may always seem better to have, larger siping, a higher void tire is what I should have actually said, a higher void tire. That's not always the case. It's not always better.
Yeah. Especially in sand, a perfectly bald tire just about, or like a factory tread tire is going to work excellent in sand because you want to maximize the flotation and you want to minimize the disruption of the silica. So the fact that you have a low void, you actually get much better flotation and you're less likely to dig a hole.
When you go to, if you ever get the chance to do kind of the sand deserts in the Gulf Peninsula, Arabian Peninsula, I should say, they run these nylon belted tires, which I want to say aren't even street legal, but they'll put them on Land Cruisers and they kind of have this texture to them that's fascinating. And they'll have this lip where kind of on the shoulder of the tire just to provide additional flotation. And they rock. And it would be the last thing you would look at and you're like, this guy has bald tires. No, it's not. And then again, with that nylon bead core, help me out here. What's the technical term for that?
Ribbing. For the carcass?
Nylon carcass or whatever. They stretch out, they get length is huge.
Oh, sure. So they even do better under flotation. And those side scallops, that kind of reminds me of that. Remember that Lamborghini SUV?
That was the first one to do that.
And it had the little side scallops. Those were awesome.
And when I did the launch for the Lamborghini Urus a while ago, and we were off-road on a track that later I saw the tractor drag tires over to make it nice and smooth. That was one of the things that they pointed out was like, just like the LM002, we have this, this little weird shoulder design thing that helps in sand because that's probably where most Lamborghini Uruses are being used. They
would actually be really fun in the sand, I bet.
Yeah. Would be a rally car.
Yeah, it'd be really fun.
I'd be all for it.
Yeah. So when we look at sand, And it's easy to think like, oh, we want these paddle tires or we want these mud tires so we can scoop the sand. That is absolutely valid when you have huge horsepower and a
huge. Like if you're going to Glamis and you have like a blown, or you have an LS9 or something in the back of a tube buggy.
Yeah. So how that works.
Don't listen to what we just said.
Yeah, that's how that works. With the scallop, with the basically the bald tires with the huge scoops on them, or a mud tire, you have to have enough horsepower and enough wheel speed to actually displace more sand, volume and weight of sand, than the resistance of the vehicle. So that's why those sand rails are so light and they're so fast. They can displace the weight of sand.
Well, they literally get up on plane.
Yeah, they
basically.
do.
It's like a boat.
It's like a jet engine.
Yeah.
It's like a jet engine of sand coming out the back. And if your Series 1 Discovery can't do that, then you're better off going with a much more tame tread pattern.
So when it comes to tires, I mean, what do you look for? I guess, I mean, you're kind of an all-terrain tire guy as well.
I am, for sure. Right now on the Defender, I have the classic XCLs, which we'll talk about in a little bit,
they look right.
Yeah, which is just purely because they're the right tire for that vintage of vehicle. But when it comes to all-terrains, I do really tend to use them. I do like the newest version of the BF Goodrich KO because they've improved a lot of that lug integrity and they've reduced a lot of the chipping, which I think is a real advantage. I ran the Continental Terrain Contact.
Oh, you had those on the G-Wagon.
On the G-Wagon. For years. And it was an excellent tire for that vehicle. Very smooth going down the road. I got an improvement in fuel economy with triple diff locks. You just really don't run into that much problem.
Bruce Dorn has those on his now. And I think even Laura's parents bought a set of those.
Yeah, they're really, really great tires. They've very much impressed me. I also like the new Toyo AT3s. I'm impressed with the amount of siping on them, the way that the lugs are configured on the tire. I had it out in the Slick Rock of Sedona recently in the Lexus, and it was incredible how much grip those tires had.
Fascinating.
Yeah, they were really fascinating.
Fascinating.
They were. Tell me more.
Tell me more.
Yeah, those were really good. So I think the thing anymore is that so many of the all-terrains are great. When Cooper came out with their AT2 or AT3, this is probably close to 10 years ago. It literally was revolutionary. It was so good. And then now everybody realized that, and they have addressed a lot of that performance.
I don't actually know a lot of bad tires in the market. Like if I was gonna, we have our preferences, and I think it's kind of, tires are like the beer you drink, Miller Lite, Bud Light, whatever. You just kind of seem to stick with a particular flavor.
Orange Blossom. Maybe I'm the snowflake. Orange Blossom beer. I probably am the snowflake. I just don't know it.
I gave you the Orange Blossom beer.
That's true.
So
you did bring it in.
Oh man, where was I going with that? There's a lot of good tires out there these days. I mean, I've been on the trail with a lot of people. I'm like, those things. And then they don't really have any issues. I mean, if I was to offer sweeping advice on all terrains, there are definitely brands out there like some national chain 4-wheel drive stores that are just selling. Yeah. They go to, as somebody in the industry, they go to the lower South Hall at SEMA to all the Chinese tire companies and say, make me something with flames on it. Yeah. And then they sell them to people and they suck. Yeah. Surprisingly, there's no actual engineering that goes into a lot of those things. But if you stick to a major tire company these days, I don't want to say that you can't go wrong, but
I think you're right. I think that they've done so much to raise their game. There's a lot of money in aftermarket tire sales. These tire companies really care about that. And they also really care about fitment on vehicles like a Jeep Rubicon, like the tire that ends up on a Tacoma or a Jeep Rubicon that says something about the brand. So they really fight for those positions, I think, in the marketplace. And they are really good. But one of the downsides of the cheaper tires is they just don't have access to things like noise canceling engineering, really understanding the finite element analysis and all of those modeling around traction profiles. And that's what you get with a better quality tire.
Yeah. Let's go on to mud terrain tires. I don't really know anything about them. I haven't used them. And the last time I used a mud terrain tire was when we had that Land Rover Trek Discovery.
Oh yeah.
Right.
For sure.
And that had
KMs on there.
KM2s.
Yeah.
And those tires, I had a few sets of them over my years. They had see-through, and see-through is basically where like you can look at the side profile of the tire.
Yeah,
they didn't technically have see-through, but they
pretty close,
pretty dang close. It's where you can literally see a line through it. Like think of a paddle tire. A paddle tire would be the definition of something that had a lot of see-through. Your lateral grip and wet or mud or anything. I parked that thing, and I don't know if I've ever told you this.
You haven't. This is new.
I parked this car, and because somebody was stuck on. It was actually on the. It wasn't on the. It might have been on the test track. There's some people stuck ahead of me. I just went out like, oh, there's snow wheeling and have fun. And I look back, and this car, which had been parked for like a minute, is now moving sideways. And I was done. Yeah, that's when I was done with mud terrain tires. But I don't know.
That's a really important characteristic, right? So that was a big problem with the KM2 was that it had very poor side slope holding. So that would happen in snow. It would happen in mud. So that channel that you said that isn't interrupted. It's an uninterrupted channel. It would just allow for the material just to flow through it, and it would slide downhill. And that means it doesn't hold its line. It's more inclined to oversteer, all kinds of problems. And if you look at the KM3, they've totally addressed that because
I haven't used the KM3, but just looking at it, it looks
so much better.
So much better.
Yeah. And it is so much better. My experience, it's a lot more quiet as well. You know, there's a lot of problems that come up with mud tires. You have a hard time keeping them balanced. They can produce a ton of noise, particularly once they start to wear. So then that just adds to that driver fatigue at the end of the trip. They don't last as long. The tread life is much less on those. If you need a mud tire though, like if you live in the Southeast and you probably want a mud tire. Yeah, exactly. The terrain has dictated that you need that particular attribute, and then make sure that you have a really great mud tire. But in most cases outside of the mud, unless you're in, again, extreme rock crawling starts to make a difference. So that's when we start talking about that mechanical keying. And that is where the lug of the tire starts to interface with a significant surface irregularity, protrusion, edge of a ledge, etc., where it actually helps to aid with the tire gripping and maintaining keying so that it can climb up the obstacle. That's something where an all-terrain may slip on that particular feature of the rock, whereas a mud tire would stay locked on, just like a rock climber climbing up the face of a surface.
Yeah. And those high voids too, I think when you get into the, particular design features of a mud terrain tire, how they can clear themselves is a really big part of that too.
For sure. In the mud, for sure. So that void, let's talk real quickly about some of the void considerations. So if you have a mud tire that has a vertical shoulder on the lug, that creates a lot of stiction and where the mud literally stays captive inside that void. So you want to look for a mud tire that has a tapered lug profile, because that allows when the tire starts to spin up, it allows it to evacuate the mud from that. And then that also aids a lot in lug integrity. So you want something with a little bit of a taper to it. And some of the newest mud tires are really smart, where they'll have small scallops on the surface of the lug that again reduce that stiction of the mud.
And BFG is doing crazy things, like they have these little like bars that kind of serve a function to kind of break that stiction, or call it that vacuum that's holding mud in there. One of the things that they're doing is they have those little rock ejectors too, which are just like
and they
crazy.
Work.
They really do.
They really do work. Anyone that's listening that knows much about swords, I don't know anything about swords except for this one particular thing.
I don't know anything about swords.
But if you look at the length of a sword blade, oftentimes they'll have this channel that runs down the flat of the blade,
like for the blood to come out.
It does the same thing. So when you impale your enemies, it allows you to pull the sword back out, so it doesn't stay stuck in the victim. So it's the same thing works with a mud tire. Apologize for that.
I have only heard that used once on this podcast, and two probably at lunch in middle school, describing, check out my sweet katana, bro.
I'm glad to know that I have risen myself to middle school discussions.
We're gonna get like a katana over your body. I'm gonna get that for you.
Oh no, my first tattoo. That's hilarious. Okay, yeah. So then on mud tires, you're going to have a significant cost to miles per gallon. There's a lot of rolling resistance that comes from a mud tire, so you need to be aware of that.
Noise is like the biggest thing. Now these new mud terrain tires, I'll particularly use I think the most recent mud tire I had was like Falcon Wild Peak MT. I have been in vehicles that have had the KM3 and they were really quiet. I've never personally owned them, but I have like Continental MPT 81s 41, 42 inches tall on my Earth Roamer. And that is the most fatiguing thing about driving that vehicle is the hum. But just constantly. And I think that's something that travelers or even, let's use a more practical case, Bob, who lives on the East Coast that wants to go to Moab, it's going to be really, really annoying for that drive.
Yeah, fatiguing.
That's something to pay attention to. And also note that as the tire wears down, oftentimes gets louder.
Yes, in most cases, that's been my experience. So we're not saying don't use mud tires if the use case scenario demands it, or if you're traveling up the length of Africa and you intend to do a bunch of off-road driving.
If you're going through the Congo.
Yeah, you're going to want to have some mud tires. But although locals do it on bald tires all the time. So we have to keep all that stuff in mind. My experience with mud tires more recently has been more positive. You do need to know that there's a lot of consequences to using a mud tire. I think in most cases, and I would admit this myself personally, in the past, I've used mud tires because they look better on the car.
They do look good.
And they look...
they are a higher performance tire.
Yeah, that's right.
Like strictly speaking, they're going to be a higher performance tire. Like there's a reason Dave Harrington puts those 41-inch IROCs on his trucks.
Yeah, that's right. Because they really do work in most off-road conditions. For travel, a lot of times we're driving highway to get there. So we have to just keep that in mind. Yeah. And then there are these new hybrid tires, which I think are important to touch base on, mostly because we want to continue to encourage manufacturers to make them because they really do, like a DuraTrack, which is one of the OG hybrids. It's an open lug side channel, and then it has a lot of siping and a fairly closed pattern down the crown of the tire. And those tires work excellent, and they're fairly quiet on the road. They have a lot of grip. They do really well on gravel. So I like the fact that we're seeing a lot more of those hybrid tires.
Yeah, the Ridge grapplers.
Have you had one of those?
I haven't.
Yeah.
I've had some friends that have had them and they seem to rave about them. I want to say they were like rotationally mold their tires, and there's some technical advantages to, I could be wrong on the term, rotational molding, but people seem to really like them. I've never, again, for me, I would be more likely to run a hybrid tire than I would a mud terrain tire these days. I'm really curious to see where that goes out. You have the Cooper ST Max, which is another kind of the OG.
I've had a lot
of driving miles behind those in Australia.
Yeah, those are great. Really durable.
Good on the beach, really durable, really great for gravel.
Yep.
Those are a great choice. I want to say Cooper just got bought by Goodyear.
Oh, it could be
$5 squillion dollars or something.
Sure.
You have the Baja ATZ P3. That is the same company as Cooper is.
No, I don't.
Mickey Thompson.
Are they?
Okay. I want to say.
Could be.
I want to say so. Milestar Patagonia is one that actually you brought up.
Yeah. I've not tried it, but it's one that's new to the market.
Yeah. So. New. And then you have those Yokohamas.
Yeah. Those are brand new. Yeah.
Geolander XAT.
Dan Grech speaks highly of those.
Yeah. He's put quite a few miles on those things.
He's had really good luck.
I think there's a huge argument if you're an overlander that is, hey, maybe I'm going to go on some more technical trails. Maybe I don't necessarily know where I'm going. Think Dan's trip through Africa. That's a great tire for that because he's doing deserts in Namibia and then he's doing
mud in the Congo
coast and the Congo. And
that's definitely the argument for the hybrids. And I'm just really excited to see what's going to come from that. And I actually plan on trying to spend more time testing those kinds of tires. So that way we can get a pretty good understanding of the performance profile of those. Should we
bust onto wheels?
Wheels? Yeah. We're going to take a quick break from this episode to thank Beyond Clothing for their support of the Overland Journal podcast. Beyond makes technical garments for overlanding, the outdoors, and also for adventure travel. They produce everything from recovery gloves to durable and weatherproof soft shells, and many of their products are made in the United States. Matt has been wearing the Ventum K4 jacket for over a year and speaks very highly of it. And I have been obsessed with this Celerus midweight pullover, and I wear it many times a week and often look for it when it's in the laundry. Beyond is also celebrating Women Explorers and has up to 40% off of women's gear through the 12th of March. For more information, check out beyondclothing.com.
If you don't have Steelies, you don't go off-road.
Well, you can't hammer them out if you don't have Steelies.
Or you can get a nice wheel that won't need hammering out. Yeah, so I guess on a broad spectrum, you have alloy wheels and you have steel wheels. I know that there's magnesium wheels, but we're not driving GT3 RSs here.
Unfortunately. Maybe that's another podcast.
It's a different one, specifically with the Wysock package for any Porsche files out there. Anyway, so, there's forge, there's cast. There's this new thing called flow forming, which is kind of in between cast and forging.
Yeah, those are very interesting.
I guess maybe you're better to get into the scientific specifics of what make these things, what they are. I have to say, for most overland uses, it seems on Instagram that the new thing is, I gotta have these forged wheels. And I'm like, no, you're doing that for likes. You don't actually need those things. I've seen the 35 mile an hour you drive with your roof tent.
Yeah.
You're not really wants.
Yeah, when it comes to wheels, I believe the most important thing is a quality manufacturer.
Yeah.
Because the big problem with cast, which is a valid concern, is this would be inclusions, or it's basically when, as the molten aluminum is being poured into the cast, that you can get these inclusions and you can get these little pockets of air that results in the start or the facilitation of a crack and damage to the wheel. And I have seen that kind of stuff happen so long ago. I don't think that that's an issue anymore. There's a bunch of upsides to cast. They can be made lighter. They could be made more complex. They can be made more easily, so they're less expensive. Forged wheels can look fantastic too. So there's advantages to both.
But you could also probably travel for a month for each wheel.
Yeah, there's a big difference. There's a big difference in price. So I think the key is to go with a good quality manufacturer.
And there are certain certifications too.
Right. DOT for sure.
They have to be DOT compliant, particularly for beadlocks. But there are these OE level certifications that you should look for. We'll put those in the show notes because they're a little bit complicated to just say out. But look for those things. There is a lot of junk out there as far as cast wheels go. Do your research. There are a plethora of, you almost can't throw a rock without hitting a quality off-road specific vehicle manufacturer or wheel manufacturer. But
there's some great ones out there.
There's great ones.
Yeah. I think about a newer one on the scene is 1552, make great looking wheels, a bunch of different, and they're kind of understated, which I like. Method has
I've had a set of Methods.
Every possible configuration of wheel you can imagine. And they've got this new kind of bead grip technology, which I need to test that. But in theory,
I have a set.
Oh, do you? So we should try that.
Trail Series 702s.
But it does look like that would actually work, particularly with a new tire.
The cost benefit between that and I've had beadlocks on Jeeps. I've had this on Jeeps. I air down quite a bit. I mean, I go down to 15 PSI sometimes when I'm on the beach in Baja, just because of the weight of the camper and everything on the back. And I like to give it the skinny pedal sometimes. And, generally for me, the beadlock thing comes into play, high speed, a lot of lateral movement, vehicles rotating, and then the bead pops off.
Yeah.
So just having a little bit of extra, that lateral stability there from that beadlock
I think it makes sense. I mean, my experience with the Arctic trucks, even down to 2 or 3 PSI, I've never lost a bead. They use a compound to help it kind of stick.
Okay.
And then they slightly oversize the wheel. Like, I don't know what the slightly is. I don't know what the dimensions are that change, but the wheel is slightly oversized from a 15 so that it's very tight. It's like it's tight fit. And I have never seen one of those. Well, actually I did have one on Eyjafjallajökull Glacier that I lost a bead, but it was easy enough to get that back on.
I'll give you another beer, if you can repeat whatever you just said that glacier was called.
Eyjafjallajökull?
Eyjafjallajökull. I'm gonna get hate mail from all 3 of our Icelandic listeners. Let me come to your country,
and they can all speak better English than both of us combined.
Yeah. And they're better looking.
Yeah.
And they have better hair.
They definitely have better hair than me.
I mean, I don't think mine's bad. But,
Yeah. So I think that beadlocks have their place. There are only a couple DOT approved beadlocks.
Compliant is the technical term there.
Gotcha. Good. That's good correction there. The Hutchinsons are one that come to mind. And then more recently, AEV came out with their Crestone, that it's a hybrid wheel where you can run it with no beadlock. You can run it as a beadlock. You can run it with a trim ring, or you can run it with a true beadlock ring. And they're fairly reasonable too, like in the high 200s per wheel.
Yeah. I mean, in my opinion, a true beadlock is something that's like a Hutchinson Hutchinson.
Right. Captures both
it
beads.
captures both sides. And the only way they're really able to do that is through this kind of nylon rubber insert that literally it has, think of it as a 16-inch wheel for a 15-inch tire. So it's a higher profile.
Yep.
The inside is absorbed by this rubber nylon piece. And then the front of the wheel is actually bolted on. So it's sandwiched. It can't go anywhere.
Yep.
Really, really tall lip. That's a proper beadlock like you'd see in a military style application with an O-ring.
Yep. And you can even have those inserts that are a run flat too. So Hutchinsons have a lot of advantages on the performance side, the durability side. They're extremely heavy, difficult to balance. In my experience, they were very difficult to balance.
You've had a set in your G. Yeah. I've had a set on your Wrangler. And then I have a set on the Earth Roamer.
Yeah.
And I have yet found a way to perfectly balance them. I've gotten them close.
Yeah.
I've also experienced a lot of like O-ring issues. Now, this isn't necessarily Hutchinson's fault.
Sure.
90% of the time, it's probably going to be, installation error.
Right.
You do have to continually torque these wheels and check them and really
They are the coolest wheel on the planet though. I mean, we talk about wants versus needs. This was a Scotty want for a really long time. And then when I finally got them and just couldn't get them to work right, I just went back to the factory G-Wagon wheels, but they're very, very cool.
And you never really have to worry about popping a bead. Like I used in my JK Rubicon, I would run 8 PSI. Why? Because I could.
Yeah.
And it was a magic carpet ride.
Yeah, for sure.
It was wonderful.
But I think those AEV Crestones are a really nice alternative. That's what I put on the Lexus and they work great.
I find for most people, they're going to push a bead off on a rock. They're going to be at low pressure and they're going to come across a rock and it's literally just it's going to wedge itself in there.
Yep.
You're going to lose pressure. Either it's preventing burping.
Yep.
And burping, guys, is literally when sidewall gets kind of pushed off of that surface that's actually holding the pressure. And then it just farts.
Yeah. And it just can be for a moment until the tire rotates and it reseals.
Or it can mean that you completely lose pressure and then your tire comes off, or it's an impact thing.
Yep.
So I think realistically, those AEV Crestones are
they're probably the best option, but in most cases, I don't think that they're necessary. And it wouldn't be something like if I was trying to decide between, can I stay traveling in Ecuador for another month or buy these more expensive wheels? I would rather travel for another month. Most OEM wheels are more than sufficient and just save the money. For sure. Yeah. But there is a place for steels too.
I think they just look right on certain cars.
They do. Yeah, they do.
Like on your Defender?
Yeah, that's right.
It just looks right.
Yeah, 7.5 XCLs on steels. It looks just right.
Oh, you never talked about, I'm holding you to this, XCLs and why you love them and John Lee loves them and no one else I know loves them. They look right, but they suck.
Yeah, they have a...
Admit it.
They suck.
Admit it.
Yeah. So they've killed me or nearly killed me, on many occasions, like anytime you hit the brakes on wet surfaces. And then they simply just look right, but they're terrible in everything but 2 ways. They do not puncture. I've never seen one punctured. Nope. It doesn't mean that they don't puncture, but I have never seen one get a puncture. And then they work great if it is very shallow mud and you just kind of dig through that surface. Yep. So they definitely have their place and they're just cool. They're cool as hell.
They will outlast you.
Yeah, totally. They're cool as hell and they live forever and they look great on classic vehicles. But if you're thinking you're going to get some performance advantage from an XCL, look elsewhere.
That would be a great greeting in some countries. I hope you live longer than an XCL.
Yeah, right. So true. But, they're cool.
Yeah, steel wheels. There's just not a lot of people doing them anymore. I mean, I guess the designs are kind of, I'm not going to say limited, but they are. They have a D-shaped hole, or a circle-shaped hole,
right? Or no hole,
Yeah,
exactly. You'll find them on less expensive vehicles, or as like a base model, or as a spare tire. Yeah. The argument that you can hammer them out is absolutely true, but I've also hammered out aluminum wheels. If you're careful, anytime I've had to hammer a wheel, it was on a motorcycle and they were all aluminum wheels. Yeah. It worked just fine. So there's some advantages around that. The disadvantage is that they are very heavy. So you have that additional rotating and reciprocating mass. So that's a downside, but there's nothing wrong with steel wheels. I think they look great.
Cool. Like the new Defender has available steel wheels.
Exactly.
It's nice. I feel like, again, wheels and tires are something that have changed so much.
They have.
Think 50 years. Like, I want to say it was Michelin or somebody posted. I saw it on some Porsche Instagram page where they posted a 1970 factory fitted Michelin tire to a 911.
Yeah.
And then they posted a picture of a 2020 factory fitted Michelin tire. And it was like
insane.
It was like drastically different.
Yeah.
But even going 10, maybe 15 years back, again, I'll use the Discovery or whatever vehicle you want, a Defender or something.
Sure.
You're putting a 235, 85, 16 on that vehicle, a 32 narrow. You had ample sidewall, not near the sidewall that like my Gladiator would have.
Sure.
So I feel like steel wheels definitely have their place, but since we can fit such larger tires with such huge flotation and huge sidewalls, I don't think alloys are really bad anymore.
No, I think they have a lot of advantages. One of the best reasons to run steel wheels is that when you're traveling internationally, you lower the profile of the vehicle.
Yeah.
They're less likely to want to steal them because they don't look like they're valuable. So that is one of the best advantages of a steel wheel. It's very understated. It doesn't look like something that's flashy and expensive and worth stealing. So, I would definitely look at steel wheels in that advantage. Personally, I think I gravitate towards them because I like the fact that they are more minimalist, that they are more understated. I find that like maybe it just kind of appeals to my practicalities a little more than some performance advantage that people make up just to justify their decision.
Yeah, it's just need versus want. I mean, I don't really see a huge difference. Like I would suspect a large percentage of drivers who swapped steel wheels for aluminum wheels, they would have no idea which set was on the car at the current time.
Yeah, it would be difficult to tell the difference between the two for sure. Absolutely. One thing that is really important to discuss on wheels that I do want to make sure that we talk about is offset.
Yes.
And it is one of the things that until I knew it and understood it, it was like a light bulb came on. You'll see a vehicle that'll have these very wide wheels that are pushed out from the
Brodozers.
Yeah.
Think of a brodozer.
Yeah. So that means that they even have a negative offset, which means that they're pushed past the center line of the hub. Those are actually extremely unsafe unless it is demanded for the application, like an Arctic truck. So the reason why vehicles come from the factory with a positive offset, which means that the majority of the wheel is inside, so distal to the surface of the hub, is because if the vehicle comes off the crown of the road and it hits a patch of snow or gravel or grass, the outside of that tire is going to catch that resistance. It's going to feel that resistance. And if it has a negative offset, it's going to pull the vehicle into the ditch. Whereas if it has a positive offset, which means when it encounters that resistance, it actually causes it to either stay neutral or to force the vehicle away from that resistance.
Leverage.
That's correct. So it's the leverage point. When you see somebody that's running these super wide wheels that are stuck way out from the hub surface and they tell you that there's some advantage to that, they're absolutely incorrect. And I used to think that, and I was incorrect. There's a reason why they have positive offsets. We need to fit positive offset wheels to our vehicles because they are much safer.
Yeah. And two, just reliability of the vehicle, all of that additional leverage that's being placed on your wheel bearings. It's the same reason
steering components, everything.
Yeah. I think that there's some vehicles that can get away with it, maybe more than others. They're also, how do you say it? I would be far more willing to accept a negative offset wheel on a 3500 pickup truck than I would a Tacoma. I mean, again, I'm not ragging on a Tacoma. I feel like I really do. Yeah.
Yeah. A heavier duty vehicle can handle it. But even the Arctic trucks that we've used, those are a Hilux, which have very similar suspension to the Tacoma. They are very robust, but there's no way around it. They have to use this negative offset. They cannot tuck the tires because they're too big. They're 18.5 inches wide. But in every other instance, we need to make sure that we're using a positive offset wheel. And we want to stick to about as the same offset that the factory has.
Moving on to wheel size, and I think it has been commonly understood that a smaller wheel is always better for off-road. And I think there's merits to that.
Sure. Flotation,
the thing that I will say now, I learned this with my F-250 that I had a while ago. I had 17-inch wheels on it. I think they were 17s for a while. And then I went up to 20s. Now I went up to 20s with a 37-inch tire. So I still had a huge amount of sidewall. That vehicle handled so much better.
Yeah.
It didn't push through the sidewall. It understeered less.
Yes, sure.
It was more direct.
Yeah.
So I think that's also something to consider.
It's the reason why sports cars have large diameter wheels and low profile tires is you have much less deflection of the sidewall, which is going to improve traceability and predictability and line holding. The downside is that you have a big reduction in flotation and more of the wheel is at risk.
Yes.
So you're much more likely to end up with
but
wheel
there is
damage.
a balance there, I guess. And that's
which
all
is the 17, right?
Yeah. And I guess that's all I'm trying to get to is recognize that vehicle speeds are faster than they used to be.
Sure.
Vehicles are significantly more powerful than they used to be.
Yep.
And kind of keep that in, like just because you could put a 15-inch wheel on your 8,000 pound full-size truck doesn't actually mean that you should.
Sure.
There's going to be that happy compromise, which generally lands at a 17.
Yeah. You look at the use case. I mean, kind of in summary on all of these things, buy the tire that best meets your needs for the majority of your driving, and then just feel comfortable with that decision. You're going to be so much happier in the long run. Avoid using a mud tire if you live in the desert Southwest and you don't plan on driving in the mud, because there's going to be a lot of upsides to having an all-terrain. And then when it comes to any of these purchases, like we talked about in the beginning, is if you need a new set of tires, then do the research and buy something that's really appropriate for you. Maybe just stick with what's stock for a while and use that money to go explore new places. And I think that as we've continued on with this podcast, it's become more and more apparent to me, and the feedback that I get is it is about the travel, and that it is the thing that brings Matt and I so much joy. And we know it brings all of you so much joy. We do need to understand how these things work so we can make good decisions and spend our money wisely, but let's spend a lot less of it if we can.
Yeah. And let's not be the people that are just about the build, about the constant changes, the constant modification. Yeah. If you've got it, run with it.
Yeah. Just run with what you got, and then find out where it works and where it doesn't, and then build appropriately. Right.
Yeah. Well, hopefully this has been enlightening for some of you. I actually learned some things from Scott, as I usually do.
Oh, it's such an interesting topic, and there's so much to explore around tires and tire performance and the way that it improves our travels and give us some insights in the way things work. And that's why we started this Principles of Overlanding series, is that we really wanted to do the deep dive into things like we have talked for an hour and 8 minutes on wheels and tires. There's so much.
We could talk for another hour.
Yeah. And again, I only know 5% of what I wish to learn. And that is what is so fun about the topic of overlanding. There is so much to learn. And we're so grateful for you all listening. Please send us your feedback and any questions that you've got.
Except for what size tires and how much lift. Yeah. If you ask what's
the largest tire I can fit on my Tacoma with no lift?
It's at 27.5. That's the answer you're going to get.
Yeah. And a picture of Dak.
I'm going to send you a link that says, let me Google that for you.
So where can they reach you, Matt? What's your
so I'm on Instagram at Matt Explore. And then you're Scott.A.Brady on Instagram, right?
That is me. Please feel free to reach out. We love hearing from those that listen to the podcast. We are working on an Ask Me Anything episode. So if there are things that you would like to ask us, like, for example, what hair products that I use, or where does Matt find these beautiful shirts, you can send us whatever questions that you've got, and we will do our best to answer them on a future episode. So thank you all for listening, and we will talk to you next time.
Adios.